Just a one-page editorial that just appeared in Science. I'm recording this in January 2026, and talks about climate ambition. Avoiding the climate ambition trap is the title. At the United Nations General Assembly in September of 2025, President Xi of China delivered a noteworthy update. In what has been a dismal year for climate news, China would reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% from its peak levels by 2035. For many, this was welcome news, but others deemed China's pledge insufficiently ambitious. This is very common in our business where renewables are doing great, but they are not fast enough for net zero, let's say, right? Yet, the conceptual and political basis for climate ambition is unclear. This matters in a year when countries will submit updated emissions pledges under the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions, which were originally submitted after Paris Agreement. They were updated and considered insufficient for meeting the global warming targets, so everybody is updating them again. Climate ambition or seriousness of intent to address climate change is often measured by benchmarking national pledges against global temperature targets. The goal is to identify and hail first movers to generate a virtuous cascade of emissions pledges, so kind of a peer pressure, let's say. According to analysts, a truly ambitious Chinese pledge would have aimed at 20 to 30% reductions to be compatible with the Paris Agreement's 2 degrees C temperature goal and 1.5 degrees C aspiration. By this benchmark, China's pledge was considered disappointing, yet most commentators also noted that Beijing's style is to under-promise and over-deliver, and that China is likely to over-comply with their own pledge. Many countries have set targets that are too low, and then they say, oh, we achieved it or achieved it ahead of time, and so on as well. Policies already in place will likely get China to at least 10% reductions. Expected policies to come will yield deeper if uncertain cuts. Analysts seem to give more weight to what China said than to a reasoned judgment of what the country would actually do. Their disappointment stemmed from China's reluctance to use its pledge as a beacon, attracting action by others, but assessing ambition based on what a country says rather than what it does or is likely to do is a problem for at least three reasons. The first one is that assessing ambition is laden with normative judgment, rendering comparison suspect. To judge a single country's pledge against global temperature targets requires assessing that country's share of global responsibility, yet operationalizing distributional questions of climate equity has proved politically intractable given different capabilities and historical emissions. A workaround has been to benchmark against least cost pathways, but this ignores equity, or to devise ranges across equity principles, but this results in broad ranges that undercut comparability. In US, they would say comparability. I don't know, but this results in broad ranges that undercut comparability. Both approaches undermine the moral weight intended to drive virtual pledge cascades from other countries. Another reason is that there is little evidence of a clear link between ambition of pledges and what countries actually do. There may even be an ambition trap. Without accountability mechanisms, countries have an incentive to reap quick reputational rewards of unrealistically high pledges. Cross-country analysis suggests some evidence for an inverse relation, in fact, between ambition and the likelihood of implementation. Pledges that outstrip domestic capability to act may be counterproductive because they erode the credibility of the Paris Pledge process itself. In addition, changes in domestic politics have historically been a more effective driver of action than pressures for global cooperation. Drivers will differ with national context. Climate adjustment concerns such as air pollution or green jobs may motivate action more than existential climate politics. In other words, climate change may be the caboose, not the engine of the climate train. So different countries are taking different approaches. The US stands out now in terms of the unpredictability. Even their own renewable energy commitments are being dismantled, let alone other climate commitments. None of this is to suggest that the pledge making process is not useful. The spotlight of regular international attention and the associated reputational risk uh, serves to mobilize and incentivize bureaucracies, create space for civil society voices, and spur attention to policy frameworks. But it is to say that attention should shift to supporting domestic dynamics rather than naming and shaming. So, should the pressure for committing to climate targets and carrying them out, implementing policies and projects, come from within the country, or should it be a, a, a show on the world stage? Well, Xi Jinping has played it on the world stage, and now the article is questioning whether that's going to work out in the end. Nor is it to suggest that the country pledges should be taken at face value. That China has committed to being on an emissions downslope is good news, but the failure to specify any emissions peak year leaves room for expanded coal use, which is what is happening. If China is to underpromise but overcomply, evidence of new and stronger policies is essential. China's dominance in green technology is important, but will its interests be served by accelerating low carbon development elsewhere or by guarding its dominance? As the United States opts out of the low carbon race, this concern is particularly salient. China is selling cheap solar panels and windmills everywhere, and that is having an impact on renewables deployment in Africa and elsewhere. So, this is a complicated game. A global shift in emphasis is needed from benchmarking pledges to understanding what they signal about how and why countries will act. Questions include whether pledges stack up against current national policies rather than abstract global emissions futures, whether sectoral plans exist that are sufficiently detailed to attract financing and are embedded in legal, institutional, and regulatory frameworks to enable implementation, and whether policies reinforce politically popular issues that are climate adjacent. Global temperature targets are important, but they serve better as a guide against which to judge actual progress ex post than speculative intent ex ante. Paris derived country pledges are worthy of attention and scrutiny, but benchmarking a country against itself may be more productive than devising speculative global benchmarks in the hope of talking up pledges. Instead of beacons, they should be evidence of a political and economic turn towards a low carbon future. And China is building new coal power plants, and it needs lots of energy for its economic growth, and it is quite ambitious in what it wants to do. It is deploying lots of renewable energy, but also burning all kinds of fossil fuels to get economically where it wants. So whether it's just a publicity drama or whether it's real, and how would we compare it with China itself would be better as to where it is now and where it's headed, when its peak year will come, and so on. And each country has to do it, because if China announces something and there is no evidence of policies or actual implementations, and other countries begin to do it, then we may just get over optimistic about where we are headed if nobody is doing anything. So, in the meantime, the emissions curves keep going up. So, global emissions curves have to peak and start declining, and each country has to do that, even though some countries will continue to peak for a while, but they cannot be majors like China. China is now the largest emitter, of course. So these are complicated issues. The editorial is interesting, so I just wanted to include it. You can follow up with other details elsewhere. Okay.